In the dead of winter, 1847, something or someone staggered out of a blizzard and into the tiny mountain town of Millbrook, Vermont. The storm had already taken 17 lives across Windham County before it spat out the man they would come to know as Samuel Hawthorne, though no record of that name exists anywhere before that fateful February night. What the people of Millbrook learned about the stranger who claimed to have come from beyond the mountains would scar their souls for generations. His medical skill would save dozens from a deadly fever. But what he truly brought with him would tear apart everything they believed about faith, survival, and human nature itself. For more than a century and 70 years, the Millbrook Historical Society has kept certain documents locked away, records detailing not just who Samuel Hawthorne really was, but what he did to endure those mountains, and what he continued doing long after the townspeople thought they'd saved him. The truth about Samuel Hawthorne isn't just a story of survival gone wrong, it's a mirror, showing just how far a human being can fall when stripped of civilization. Monsters, it turns out, don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they wear the face of a savior. Before we get deeper into this tale of horror and survival, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the story you're about to hear digs into one of America's darkest historical mysteries. And drop a comment telling us what state you're listening from, because you might be shocked by how many similar disappearances occurred across New England during those brutal winters of the 1840s. The vanishings historians later discovered a disturbing pattern. Following Hawthorne's trail through New England, over 60 families vanished across 4 states in just a few years. The authorities didn't connect the disappearances until it was far too late. The records I'm about to share come from sources that have never been digitized and were kept from the public for over a century because what they reveal about human nature is not for the faint of heart. In 1847, Millbrook was one of those tight-knit frontier towns where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. It sat hidden in a narrow valley between the Green Mountains, about 40 miles northeast of Bennington. The population barely reached 300, mostly farmers, loggers, and their families, each clinging to survival in a landscape that demanded everything. The town was founded back in 1789 by veterans of the Revolutionary War who wanted cheap land and a new start. But by the mid-1840s, it had faded into one of those forgotten places that only existed between larger settlements. The winding mountain roads that connected it to the outside world became impassable for months at a time during the long Vermont winters. And the winter of 1846 to 47, it was the worst anyone could remember. The frozen town doctor, Ezekiel Putnam, Millbrook's only physician, had written in his journal that year that whiskey froze solid in bottles left overnight. The Connecticut River, their lifeline for trade and fresh water, froze 4 feet deep by January. Even seasoned men like Henrik Bergstrom, a Norwegian logger who'd survived Arctic winters, swore he'd never felt cold like that in his life. Main Street, Millbrook's heart, was a muddy swamp in summer and a frozen wasteland in winter. Along it stood Jeremiah Prescott's General Store, a 2-story wooden building that served as the town's lifeline. Prescott was a clever merchant who'd come from Connecticut in 1839, and he wrote down everything, transactions, gossip, and rumors alike. Decades later, those meticulous ledgers would become crucial evidence in piecing together Hawthorne's influence. At the far end of Main Street stood the Millbrook Inn, run by Abigail Forrest, a widow whose husband had died in a logging accident 3 years before. She kept rooms for stranded travelers and hosted the town's evening gatherings, where locals would drink corn whiskey, play cards, and trade stories. And overlooking the town square stood the little white church, where Reverend Isaiah Greenfield, a stern Congregationalist minister educated at Yale, tried to hold his dwindling congregation together. By 1847, even he was losing faith. The winters had broken the town's spirit. Faith in God was giving way to whispers of curses and omens. Most families lived in single-room wooden homes, heated by whatever firewood they'd managed to gather before the snow made the forests impassable. The Thornburys, Thomas, Grace, and their 3 children, Sarah, 12, Mary, 8, and little William, 5, were among the more prosperous. They owned the largest farm in the valley, with multiple fireplaces and a cellar stocked with what little food they could preserve. By February, though, Millbrook was barely hanging on. 5 residents had already died from cold and illness. Henrik Bergstrom had been found frozen solid in his cabin. Chimney collapsed during a blizzard. Margaret Fairchild's baby died of pneumonia despite Dr. Putnam's best efforts. And now, the town was running out of food. The last supply wagons had arrived in November. Putnam's medical stock was almost gone. His last bottles of laudanum and quinine nearly empty. People whispered that the town was cursed, that Millbrook was never meant to survive. Some older families quietly vowed to leave come spring, if spring ever came. That was the world Samuel Hawthorne walked into. A dying town desperate for salvation, and that's exactly what he offered. February 18th, 1847, that date is etched into every survivor's memory. According to journals, 6 different residents recorded strange events beginning that night. 14-year-old Timothy Prescott, Jeremiah's son, was the first to see him. The boy had been checking the back windows of the store for ice damage when he spotted a dark shape moving through the storm. Something that looked like a walking corpse against the swirling white. At first, Timothy thought it was a trick of the light. But then the figure came into focus, moving purposefully down the mountain trail as if he knew exactly where he was going. No one survived in that weather, not out in the open, but this man walked through it as if guided by some invisible map. Timothy called for his father, and within minutes, half the men in town were gathered at the store, staring through the blizzard at the stranger's approach. What they saw didn't make sense. The winds were strong enough to bend trees sideways, but the man walked upright, steady, unhindered. By the time he reached the edge of town, even the most skeptical among them believed they were watching a dead man walk. The stranger, he called himself Samuel Hawthorne. His clothes were unlike anything the townsfolk had ever seen, a long cloak made from treated hide that seemed to repel snow, and beneath it, layers of fabric that caught the light like woven metal. His boots left deep geometric tracks in the snow, unlike any pattern known to New England cobblers. Dr. Putnam would later sketch those prints in his journal, writing that they resembled instruments of design, not footwear. But what truly astonished everyone wasn't his clothing, it was his condition. Despite walking through days of lethal frost, Hawthorne showed no signs of frostbite. His skin was flushed with warmth, his hands steady, his speech clear. He stood over 6 feet tall, lean and strong, with dark hair streaked prematurely white. His sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes gave him a look that made people uneasy, as if he saw right through them. Children stared at him with fascination. Adults kept their distance. Everyone agreed on one thing. Samuel Hawthorne made you feel studied, as if he were silently recording every word and gesture for reasons only he understood. His accent was strange, not British, not German, not Scandinavian, but something blended, something borrowed from everywhere and nowhere. His words were precise, his tone calm. When pressed about his origins, he would only say he came from beyond the Great Peaks, from lands where the sun moves differently and the seasons obey older rules. He spoke of a people who lived in harmony with the cruelties of nature, who accepted what others feared and called it wisdom. To the children, his stories were magical. To the adults, they were deeply unsettling. But what he carried with him, his leather satchel, filled with medicines and tools of survival, would soon become the source of both miracles and nightmares in Millbrook. That first night, warming himself by the fire in Abigail Forestk's inn, he heard little Sarah Thornbury coughing, a sickness that had worried Dr. Putnam for weeks. Hawthorne asked to listen. Then, opening his satchel, he took out a vial filled with dark, pine-scented liquid and told Sarah to take 3 drops mixed with warm water. Within an hour, her coughing stopped. By morning, she was breathing easy for the first time in weeks. Word spread fast. By nightfall, half the town lined up at the inn, desperate for his remedies. And that's how Samuel Hawthorne became Millbrook's second doctor. And soon, its most trusted man. But trust, as the people of Millbrook would learn, can be more dangerous than any storm. Before we continue with what happened next, the strange medicines, the disappearances, and the secrets hidden in Hawthorne's satchel, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who loves historical mysteries. Because what began as a miracle in the mountains would soon turn into one of America's darkest legends. Within days of his arrival, Samuel Hawthorne had become a local hero. His mysterious medicines worked when Dr. Putnam's supplies and knowledge had failed. Fever, coughing fits, infections. Each seemed to vanish after only a few drops from his little vials or a spoonful of his herbal tonics. By the end of that first week, people were calling him a gift from Providence, a man sent by heaven to rescue Millbrook from its cursed winter. But what they didn't know was that Providence had nothing to do with it. You're listening to America's Darkest Histories, and tonight we're diving deeper into the strange case of Samuel Hawthorne, the mountain healer who saved a town and destroyed it from within. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling us whether you'd have trusted a stranger like this during a blizzard. Let's pick up where we left off. A miracle worker at first. Even Dr. Ezekiel Putnam couldn't deny Hawthorne's skill. The stranger diagnosed conditions with uncanny accuracy, sometimes just by listening to someone's breath or looking at the color of their eyes. He gathered herbs in the dead of winter, pulling sprigs of green from beneath 3 feet of snow. He always seemed to know exactly where to find what he needed. When little Sarah Thornbury fell ill again, coughing blood this time, Hawthorne told the worried parents he could save her. But his method would seem strange to those who still cling to civilized fears. He prepared a thick, dark broth from roots and what he called preserved mountain meat. The smell filled the Thornbury kitchen, sweet and earthy, but with something else beneath it, something that made Grace Thornbury's stomach twist. Yet the miracle worked. Within days, Sarah's strength returned. She slept soundly for the first time in weeks, but the child began to whisper about her dreams of snowfields filled with shapes that weren't quite human, calling her to join them in a sacred feast. Grace Thornbury brushed it off as fevered imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. That same week, Hawthorne moved into the Thornbury home. Grace insisted on it, believing the healer should be cared for in gratitude for saving her daughter. Her husband Thomas objected, but Grace was firm. "He saved our little girl," she said. "We owe him that much." What she didn't realize was that she had just invited darkness into her home, the night watcher from. Her letters, found decades later in the Thornbury family papers, we know that Grace began documenting everything Hawthorne did. She noticed that he rarely slept, and when he did, it was only for an hour or two before waking suddenly and sitting motionless by the window, staring into the endless white. Sometimes, during blizzards, he'd vanish into the storm for hours. He claimed to be gathering rare ingredients, but when he returned, his boots were barely wet and his coat carried no snow. He often brought back fresh meat, even though no hunter in Millbrook had seen a living animal for weeks. He said the cuts came from deer or rabbits, but to Dr. Putnam's trained eye, the bone structure was wrong. One night, Putnam visited the Thornberrys to check on Sarah and asked to examine a piece of meat Hawthorne had been using for his remedies. Under the lamplight, he realized it resembled human muscle tissue. When he confronted Hawthorne, the man just smiled. "All meat is the same, Doctor," he said softly. "It nourishes life regardless of its source. The only difference lies in how one prepares it and the reverence with which one consumes it." Putnam felt his blood run cold. The silver locket grace. Thornberry's unease deepened one morning when she found Hawthorne sitting at the kitchen table, cleaning a silver locket. The tune he hummed was low and haunting, a melody that made her skin crawl. When she asked where he'd gotten it, he smiled that unsettling smile again and said, "It belonged to a dear friend who could not make the journey with me. But her spirit travels with me always." Grace froze. She recognized the locket. It was identical to one worn by Rebecca Henley, the merchant's wife, who had vanished with her husband while traveling to Albany months before the storm. Search parties had found nothing but their empty wagon. Hawthorne's explanation didn't sit right with her. But she said nothing. Fear does that. It convinces you that silence is safer. That night, she heard soft scraping sounds coming from Hawthorne's room. Metal against wood. A muffled whimper. Then silence. Thomas tried to dismiss it as wind in the walls, but the pattern of the noises was too deliberate. When Thomas finally asked Hawthorne about it, the stranger claimed he was working on maps to help him find his way back home. He even showed them. Large sheets of animal hide covered with strange symbols and routes that seemed to map not just the valley, but regions far beyond what anyone in Millbrook had ever seen. At first, the drawings looked like topographic studies, but there were tally marks beside certain locations, and numbers, as if he were keeping count of something or someone. The doctor's discovery, Doctor. Putnam's skepticism turned into obsession. He began secretly collecting samples of Hawthorne's medicines, hoping to analyze them with what few tools he had. One night, using his microscope, he found what looked like human hair and bone fragments in the powders Hawthorne called antler and root. When Putnam confronted him again, the doctor expected denial or outrage. Instead, Hawthorne seemed pleased. "Ah," he said, smiling. "So you've begun to understand. The body heals best when it is restored by its own essence. Human tissue is the ultimate medicine. Properly prepared, it does more than cure. It transforms." Putnam realized in horror that the man wasn't just using human remains for medicine. He was conditioning the townspeople to accept it. The nightmares, the sudden cravings for meat, the growing aggression. It was all part of his plan. Bit by bit, he was breaking down their natural revulsion to the unthinkable, the hidden cache. The turning point came thanks to young Timothy Prescott, the same boy who had first seen Hawthorne emerge from the blizzard. While exploring behind the Thornberry property, Timothy stumbled upon a partially hidden cave, its entrance covered by snow and fallen logs. Inside, he found a chamber lined with treated hides that looked disturbingly similar to the material of Hawthorne's coat. And inside that chamber was proof. Stacks of clothing, men's shirts, women's dresses, children's coats, all cut and stained. Personal belongings neatly arranged, wedding rings, watches, jewelry, tiny toys, family photos, each one a life erased, but the worst part was the drawings. Dozens of them, wrapped in oilcloth, anatomical sketches showing the human body dissected with surgical precision. Every muscle labeled, every cut marked for preservation. They weren't medical diagrams. They were butcher's charts. At the bottom of the pile lay a journal, written in Hawthorne's distinct hand. The entries went back 3 years, describing expeditions into the mountains, harvesting, preservation of resources, and the efficient recycling of life. Timothy ran to his father, Jeremiah, who at first thought the boy was spinning ghost stories. But when he saw the evidence himself, disbelief turned to horror. The journal described how Hawthorne lured travelers during storms, families, hunters, anyone vulnerable, and used them as material. It detailed methods for storing meat through long winters, blending small portions into medicine to introduce the communion, and tracking psychological effects on those who consumed it. It was a manual for creating cannibals. The investigation, Jeremiah Prescott knew he couldn't go to the townsfolk. Immediately, Hawthorne had too much influence. To accuse the man who had saved them would be suicide. Instead, he confided in Dr. Putnam. The doctor's own findings confirmed every word of the journal. Together, they began gathering evidence, interviewing those treated by Hawthorne. They noticed the same symptoms: vivid dreams of feasts in the snow, cravings for raw meat, and a growing sense of unity that bordered on fanaticism. Putnam tried to test Hawthorne again, pretending to be a willing student. When he suggested they document these miraculous methods for medical journals, Hawthorne's calm demeanor finally cracked. "My work isn't for outsiders," he hissed. "The uninitiated could never understand. To share this knowledge with the weak would corrupt its power and bring ruin." Meanwhile, Prescott quietly tracked disappearances across New England. What he found was chilling. In Grafton, Vermont, 1844, a man named Samuel Hawthorne had appeared during a diphtheria outbreak, saving dozens before vanishing with several families. In North Conway, New Hampshire, 1845, a Samuel Blackthorne cured famine-stricken settlers before disappearing into the mountains. Different towns. Same pattern. Same man each time. He arrived during a crisis, healed the sick, fed the hungry, and then the missing began. The truth in the blood. Putnam's chemical tests on Hawthorne's tonics confirmed his worst fears. The medicine contained human tissue from multiple people, mixed with compounds that affected the brain, creating dependency and weakening moral inhibition. These weren't cures. They were psychological conditioning agents, designed to break down human resistance. When Putnam confronted Hawthorne one final time, the man didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed proud. "You see, Doctor," Hawthorne said softly, "in the wilderness morality is a luxury. When hunger and cold take hold, there are no good men, only those who live and those who feed. My work frees people from the illusions of civilization. It teaches them what survival truly means." Putnam described the encounter in his journals. "I looked into his eyes and saw no madness, only conviction. He believes he is saving us." From that moment, Putnam knew what they were dealing with. Not a murderer, not a lunatic, but a missionary. A man spreading a gospel of flesh and survival. By March of 1847, Millbrook was no longer the town it had been. Families whispered of new teachings, new truths about the mountain's gifts. Children sang eerie songs Hawthorne had taught them about eating what the snow provides. And as Dr. Putnam would later write, the sickness that gripped Millbrook that winter was not of the body, but of the soul. Stay with us, because in Part 3, we'll uncover what happened when those suspicions turned into open confrontation, and how one night of horror changed Millbrook forever. Before we continue, make sure to like this story, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, and tell us in the comments, if you were starving in a blizzard, what would you be willing to do to survive? By early March of 1847, Millbrook was a town divided. On one side stood the few who still trusted reason, men like Dr. Ezekiel Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott, who had seen what Samuel Hawthorne truly was. On the other side were those who had tasted his medicines, felt his miracles, and now worshipped him with a quiet, unnerving devotion. The line between faith and fanaticism was gone. What began as gratitude had turned into something far darker, a collective belief that Hawthorne's teachings were the only way to survive. The townspeople had started calling themselves the Fed, saying they were bound by the flesh of the mountain. Even Reverend Greenfield, the once righteous minister, began losing members of his congregation to the healer's quiet sermons about the communion of survival. You're listening to America's Darkest Histories. If you're just joining us, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell, and get ready. Because what happened next in Millbrook, Vermont, isn't just a ghost story. It's a study in how an entire community can be consumed from the inside out. The children of the feast by now, subtle changes had become unmistakable. Patients cured by Hawthorne no longer simply recovered, they changed. Their eyes took on that same pale, predatory shimmer as his. They craved meat, even raw, tearing into it with alarming hunger. Some were caught sneaking into their neighbors' smokehouses late at night. Children began playing games that mimicked butchery, pretending to skin imaginary animals and discussing how to preserve the bones so nothing goes to waste. When questioned, they quoted Hawthorne directly, "Waste is the only sin in nature." Dr. Putnam's journal from that period reads like the diary of a man watching civilization collapse in slow motion. "They no longer see human flesh as sacred," he wrote. "The medicine has changed them. They speak of hunger like it's a holy calling." The most horrifying proof came from the Thornbury family themselves. Mary's hunger, it started with the youngest child. Mary Thornbury, who had once been the gentlest soul in town. Grace found her one night in the cellar, crouched beside a barrel, gnawing at a slab of salted pork. The child's small hands and face were smeared with blood, and her eyes shone with that same ghostly light. When Grace tried to take the meat away, Mary growled, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong in a child's throat. Then she spoke in a voice that wasn't quite hers. "The teacher says we should eat what the mountain provides," she whispered. "He says the old people were wrong to waste good food just because it had 2 legs instead of 4. When we learn the true way, we'll never be hungry again." Grace Thornbury's heart broke that night. Her daughter had been turned into one of them, the barn discovery. The final breaking point came days later. Thomas Thornbury, returning from checking the fences, noticed a faint light flickering inside the barn. When he went to investigate, he found Hawthorne standing over the workbench used for slaughtering livestock. The man was humming softly, his sleeves rolled up, his strange curved knives glinting in the candlelight. On the table lay what Thomas first assumed was a deer carcass. But as he drew closer, his stomach dropped. The flesh was pale. The bones were wrong, human. Hawthorne didn't even look startled. He turned slowly, smiling as though he were explaining a simple farm chore. "Ah, Thomas," he said evenly. "You've come at the perfect time. I was hoping someone in the family would want to learn." Thomas froze, his breath coming fast. Hawthorne gestured toward the body with casual pride. "This poor traveler was dying when I found him. Rather than let his body go to waste, I've preserved what nature gave us. Your daughter's medicine came from this same stock. That's why her recovery was so complete." Thomas's voice trembled. "You've been feeding my family, human beings." "I've been feeding them life," Hawthorne corrected calmly. "Real life. My people understand that to consume is to continue, that every death feeds the living, and in doing so, creates eternity." Then he set down his knife, his eyes glowing in the candlelight. "Your family, Thomas, is becoming something greater, something that will never fear hunger or cold again. The world beyond these mountains is dying, but here we are learning the true way." Thomas stumbled back, unable to speak. What he had just witnessed would have shattered the mind of any sane man. If this story's giving you chills right now, Share it with someone who loves dark history and let us know in the comments. Would you have believed your own eyes? Or would you have thought the cold had finally driven you mad? Because for Thomas Thornbury, that line between sanity and nightmare was about to vanish completely. The plan by mid-March, Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott knew they had to act. They gathered their evidence, the journal, the samples, the letters, and quietly recruited a handful of men they trusted, Reverend Greenfield, innkeeper Joshua Forrest, and Constable Marcus Hartwell. Their goal was simple: arrest Samuel Hawthorne before he could flee or spread his teachings further. They would search his belongings, bring the proof to Bennington, and let federal authorities deal with whatever this man truly was. But Hawthorne had always been 3 steps ahead. That night, March 15th, 1847, the group approached the Thornbury house through falling snow. They saw candlelight flickering from every window, too bright, too rhythmic. Inside, a low humming echoed, like many voices chanting softly in unison. The House of Communion, Thomas Thornbury, opened the door, but the man standing there was no longer the one they knew. His eyes were pale and glassy, his smile too wide, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the strike. Behind him stood Grace, her dress stained, her hands red. Her expression was serene, too serene. "Samuel has been teaching us," Thomas said in a voice that wasn't his own. "We've learned what true survival means. Would you like to join us?" Dr. Putnam pushed past him, heart hammering. The house smelled of smoke and iron, of blood. In the center of the main room stood the dining table, draped in a white cloth soaked dark. Around it sat the Thornburys and several neighbors who had supposedly gone home earlier that night. On the table lay what at first looked like butchered livestock. Then the doctor saw the hands, human hands. The body had been dismembered with surgical precision. Different cuts arranged neatly as if for a feast. Organs placed in labeled jars with those same cryptic symbols from Hawthorne's maps. And kneeling beside it, working with calm concentration, was Samuel Hawthorne. Doctor," he said, still focused on his task. "Perfect timing. You've come to witness the final stage. Young Mary's initiation requires direct participation. Theory means nothing without practice." Putnam's stomach turned. "You're murdering them," he whispered. "You're feeding them human flesh." Hawthorne stood slowly, the candlelight catching the blade in his hand like a ritual tool. "Murder, no. Transformation. These people were dying of starvation and fear. Now they're united. Strong. Free from the lies of your civilized morality." Reverend Greenfield, trembling, shouted, "You're talking about cannibalism. You've turned these people into monsters." Hawthorne laughed. A quiet, genuine laugh that froze everyone in the room. "Monsters, Reverend. Look at them. They're healthy, content, alive. Your sermons never gave them that. I did." The uprising then, without warning, all hell broke loose. Hawthorne gave a small nod, and his followers, neighbors, friends, families, moved as one. They lunged at the intruders with unnatural speed, eyes wide and hungry. Constable Hartwell drew his pistol, but Thomas Thornbury struck first, his nails raking across the constable's face like claws. Grace lunged at Reverend Greenfield, a kitchen knife flashing in her hand. And the Thornbury children, Sarah, Mary, and little William, attacked with frightening coordination, crawling under tables, biting, clawing, shrieking in voices that didn't sound human. Dr. Putnam fought desperately, using his bag as a shield, struggling to reconcile the faces of the attackers with the people he'd once delivered babies for, the people he'd healed. These were not the same souls. They had been hollowed out and filled with something else. Outside, Jeremiah Prescott grabbed Joshua Forrest and pulled him toward the horses. "We need help," he shouted. "Bennington, go now." Joshua rode into the storm. He never made it. By dawn, Only Putnam remained alive among the rescuers, stumbling into town, bleeding and half delirious, muttering about eyes that shone like ice and voices that prayed as they ate. The siege of Millbrook, the surviving townspeople rallied what strength they had left. Armed with hunting rifles and torches, they surrounded the Thornbury farm, but the place had been transformed into a fortress. Windows boarded, trenches dug, fires burning in patterns that looked ritualistic. The siege of the Thornbury house lasted 3 days. Inside, Hawthorne's converts fought with terrifying precision, organized, strategic, almost military. They seemed tireless, coordinated, as if following silent commands. Their screams weren't of pain but of ecstasy. Each time one fell, the others dragged the body away before it could be recovered. Outside, Dr. Putnam documented everything. His final entries from that week are still locked in the Vermont Historical Society archives. We fight against neighbors, but their faces are gone. The light behind their eyes is gone. They defend him as if he were God himself. On the third night, fires broke out across the valley. By morning, the Thornbury house stood silent. When the townsfolk broke through the barricades, they found it empty. Hawthorne and his followers had vanished. The aftermath spring came late that year, and with the thaw came horrors buried beneath the snow. Search parties found cache sites throughout the mountains. Bundles of preserved meat wrapped in treated hide, human bones stripped clean, and personal belongings from travelers who had gone missing for years. Of the 43 townspeople who had fallen under Hawthorne's spell, only 12 ever returned. They wandered back one by one, hollow-eyed and quiet. None would speak of what they had seen in the mountains. Dr. Putnam wrote, "They are alive, but their humanity is gone. When I look into their eyes, I see hunger, not for food, but for something I dare not name." If you've stayed with us this far, hit like, share this story, and comment below. What do you think happened to Samuel Hawthorne and his followers after they disappeared into those mountains? Because the records we found suggest his work was far from over. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll follow the trail of the pale-eyed healer beyond Vermont, into the shadows of New England, and uncover how one man's twisted philosophy nearly created a secret network of cannibal communities across America's frontier. When dawn finally broke over Millbrook after that 3-day siege, the snow was red. Smoke drifted from the Thornbury farm like a funeral shroud, and the silence that followed was worse than the screams that had filled the nights before. The house stood empty. The barricades, the tools, the signs of battle, everything remained. But Samuel Hawthorne and his followers had vanished as if swallowed by the mountains. What was left behind were pieces of a nightmare that no one in Vermont would ever forget. You're listening to America's Darkest Histories, and this is the final part of our investigation into the Millbrook incident. The story of the man who arrived as a healer and left as something else entirely. If you haven't yet, tap that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and share this episode with someone who loves dark American legends, because this ending proves that some monsters don't die. They adapt. The remnants of Millbrook. When rescuers entered the Thornbury house, they found only blood and ritual symbols painted in ash. The walls were carved with geometric marks identical to those on Hawthorne's maps. In the center of the room where the feast had taken place sat an open book, half burned, its pages covered in a mixture of blood and ink. The last legible line read, "When the flesh is shared, the cold cannot claim us." The remaining townsfolk, barely 100 souls, buried their dead and sealed off the Thornbury property. Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, one of the few survivors of the confrontation, led a cleanup operation that uncovered cache sites in the woods. Bundles of preserved flesh wrapped in that same weatherproof hide, jars filled with unidentifiable tissue, and tools that were equal parts surgical and ritualistic. They also found personal effects belonging to travelers who had gone missing for years. Rings, toys, Bibles, a child's wooden horse carved with the initials RH. That single discovery confirmed what everyone already feared. Hawthorne's medicine had been human from the beginning. Putnam's notes describe the heartbreak of those days. We tried to cleanse the town with fire, but the sickness was not in the walls or the blood. It was in our minds, the realization that we had invited the darkness ourselves because it came offering help. Within months, Millbrook was a ghost town. Those who hadn't joined Hawthorne left, unable to bear the memory or the suspicion that perhaps the infection, the hunger, still lived in them. Evidence in the mountains, when the snows melted. Search parties ventured into the higher peaks. What they discovered turned the tragedy of Millbrook into something much larger. Scattered across the wilderness were dozens of hidden caches, each one organized like a miniature laboratory. They contained preserved human remains, herbs, surgical instruments, and ledgers written in Hawthorne's meticulous hand. These weren't random killings. They were experiments. Each ledger outlined what Hawthorne called field studies in survival psychology. He described how starvation, isolation, and ritual could reshape moral boundaries, how civilized instinct could be stripped away to reveal the primal truth beneath. The caches stretched across Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts, suggesting that Hawthorne had been operating for at least a decade, moving from town to town, testing, refining, and perfecting his teachings. More disturbing still, one site contained instructions for establishing independent survival colonies, complete with supply lists and recruitment methods. Hawthorne called them communes of efficiency. Dr. Putnam realized too late that Millbrook had not been an accident. It had been a prototype. The discovery of the mountain settlement in late April of 1847. A hunter following animal tracks stumbled upon what looked like an abandoned camp deep in the high valleys north of town. But it wasn't a simple camp. It was an organized settlement. There were storage pits lined with stone, racks for drying meat, and structures built from logs and hides, arranged in a perfect circle. Inside one hut, they found Hawthorne's distinctive tools and several journals labeled simply The Continuation. These journals revealed everything. Hawthorne hadn't been driven by madness or hunger. He had been working under instruction. He wrote of the council and the directors, shadowy figures funding his research into post-civilizational survival. The goal: to create human communities capable of enduring total societal collapse by abandoning conventional morality. According to his writings, the Millbrook experiment had exceeded expectations. His converts had demonstrated the necessary adaptability. Their psychological transformation had been stable, suggesting the model could be replicated. Putnam's team burned the site to the ground, but copies of those journals survive in state archives, sealed for more than a century. The pattern continues. Despite the destruction of Millbrook, the disappearances didn't stop. 4 years later, in 1851, stories emerged from the northern woods of Maine about a pale-eyed stranger offering medical help to logging camps devastated by fever. The survivors called him the Winter Doctor. In 1854, a man matching the same description appeared in the mountains of New Hampshire, again during a brutal winter, treating sick families with tonics that worked almost too well. When spring came, he and several locals were gone. By 1859, miners in northern Michigan told of a tall man with streaks of white in his dark hair, who taught them how to survive on what the mountain provides. When the company's supply wagons finally reached the site, they found signs of ritual slaughter and only half the crew still alive. The others, including the stranger, had disappeared. Every incident followed the same pattern: arrival during crisis, miraculous healing, sudden loyalty, and finally, vanishing. Dr. Putnam, before his death in 1863, wrote his final entry. The man we knew as Samuel Hawthorne understood something terrible about human nature, that under the right conditions, morality collapses. He did not create monsters, he revealed them. The broader implications modern psychologists studying mass manipulation and cult behavior often cite the Millbrook case as one of the earliest examples of large-scale psychological conditioning. Hawthorne's methods, gradual introduction of taboos, creation of dependence, isolation from outsiders, and reframing moral boundaries, mirror the tactics of modern extremist movements and coercive groups. He knew that fear and gratitude could rewrite human instincts faster than any sermon. By offering salvation in the form of medicine, he made obedience feel like survival. Some historians even argue that the Civil War atrocities committed just a decade later, acts ordinary men would never have imagined themselves capable of, prove Dr. Putnam's warning true. Once survival becomes the only virtue, everything else becomes negotiable. The survivors, a handful of Millbrook survivors, lived long enough to be interviewed in the early 1900s. Their testimonies, preserved by the Vermont Historical Society, are chilling. One woman, then 93, described dreams that had haunted her since childhood. "In my sleep, I walk through snow that glows blue under the moon. I see faces calling to me, faces I once knew. They tell me the feast is ready." Another survivor, a man who moved west under a false name, confessed to waking each night to chew raw meat in his sleep. He claimed it was the only way to keep the nightmares away.